Alright, hello everyone. This is Elk here to bring you my tier rankings for this year's Achievement of the Week and Achievement of the Month games from RetroAchievements AOTW event this year. So before we get started with the rankings, we are going to give a shout out to the ones that I did not get to play this year, whether it was from a skip or a swap or what happened with it. So games that I will not be including in my ranking today are Clock Tower 3, Maple Story DS, Shining Force 3, GTA Liberty City, Ridge Racer 2, Setsuno Starfy 3, the critically acclaimed, or shall we say not so acclaimed, Super Mario World Tsunami Island, Minute Hero, Mother 3, Spyro 1 JP Edition, Haunting Ground, Ape Escape, Suikoden, and Earthbound. Through a combination of liking the swap options, having more going on in real life at the times those came around, these are ones that I don't really have a defined opinion on. So with that, we'll get into our tier rankings with the first achievement of the week we had this year, Flower, Sun, and Rain. This was a very interesting puzzle game, with definitely some mystery stuff going on. On the whole, I think it came up a little short of its mark. I'm going to put it here in the C tier. Next up, we have Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit on the PS1. Reasonably solid car racing game. Wouldn't consider it one of the best racing games I've ever played, but it also was not bad. It was respectable, it was solid. It earns a spot in the B tier. Next up, we have the Game Boy Advance ROM hack, Pokemon Rocket Fire Red. This was a hack that lent pretty far into its edgier side at times, and I could definitely see the case for having it low. It did have some fun things going on with some of the mechanics in it, with the stealing, with the bounty systems. All in all, it had things that wanted to put it in A, it had things that wanted to put it all the way down in D. I think it balances out to about a B in the end. It was a decent hack. It was not one of the best hacks I've ever played, but it was respectable. Next, we have the unfortunate Mega Man entry, Mega Man X6. Not one of the better acclaimed Mega Man entries, and as much as I'm a fan of classic Mega Man and Mega Man X, this was not one of the better Mega Man X games I've played. It earns what is for now the top spot in our C tier, ahead of Flower, Sun, and Rain. Then we get the Castlevania roguelike hack. This was the Castlevania Aria of Sorrow roguelike edition, and this was the first really awesome game that we got this year in Achievement of the Week. This was a really cool experience, just trying to survive 100 rooms, going through wave after wave of enemies, completely different drops every time you play. It combined the coolest elements of Castlevania and roguelikes. I could honestly even consider this for S tier. We'll be coming back and doing an overall top 10 at the end of it, and if we don't get 10 entries in S tier, I could easily see this sneaking into the top 10 out of the A tier. It's going to be one of the strongest entries in the A tier. Speaking of strong entries in the A tier, we get Dissidia Final Fantasy on the PSP. Another extremely solid, interesting mechanics in what is nominally a fighting game with strong RPG elements. You unlock new moves for your character. Really interesting combat too, all things considered. Definitely a solid A tier spot. I had gotten to experience this game a little before, but getting to play it again this year in Achievement of the Week was extremely cool. Next, we're coming up on Rune Factory. Rune Factory sort of tried to mix a farming game and a dungeon crawl game. It had a lot of ambition. I admire a lot of what it was trying to do. Unfortunately, I don't think it quite worked as well as it wanted to. It's going to get a spot in the C tier here. Very solid game in some ways, but it came up a little short of its ambition. I think it deserves a spot in the C tier. It definitely isn't a D or F kind of game, but I don't think it quite has what it takes to reach the upper tiers either. Next, we get Super Bomberman on the SNES. Super Bomberman was a really interesting game. I hadn't had a whole lot of experience with the Bomberman franchise as a whole before this. I could see this going in B tier. or I could see this going in A. It's like right on that border between B and A. Think I'm gonna put it in A. It was a pretty cool experience. It's not quite as good as the other two games that have made it into A so far. It's definitely the lowest spot in this A tier, but it's better than the two games that are in B tier by enough of a margin. I think it deserves a spot in A. Next up, we get Tony Hawk 4. I'm not the biggest skateboarding games fan. Honestly, when this game came up, I was mentally flagging it for something like D tier or F tier. Definitely took a lot of practice, especially for someone less familiar with these skateboarding games. However, by the end of my time with it, I actually really grew to respect it. It did a lot for the genre of the skateboarding game, and it got me to appreciate skateboarding games more than I used to. I'm willing to give it a spot in B tier here. Now we come on one of the very, very, very cool games that we had this year, Torneco's Mystery Dungeon. This is a game I'd never even heard of before it came up in Achievement of the Week. And it's this very cool dungeon crawling game. Very like classic roguelike style going on. Lots of different monsters that you get to fight, get new gear. It was a really cool and one of the original Mystery Dungeon games too. It gets my first spot in S tier of the day. Torneco's Mystery Dungeon, S tier, definitely going to be in contention for those top 10 spots. We go from a game that I'd never even heard of to a game that I owned and played the crap out of on original hardware, the Pokemon trading card game for Game Boy Color. A very fun experience, the Pokemon trading card game. It absolutely holds up all these years later. I don't think it quite makes it to S tier, but it really holds up. Acquiring cards, building interesting strategies. Granted, like Bill and Professor Oak is a little broken. Rain Dance strategy is a little broken. This is a clear A tier game. We go from Pokemon TCG for Game Boy Color to one of the most memed on games of the year, Excalibur 2097. This has all the elements of one of the absolute highlights of last year's list. The Kabuki Quantum Ninja game was one of the absolute highlights of last year's list. It's this jumping, slashing, high-flying adventure. And on its surface, Excalibur, especially with some of the boss cheese going on, looks like it wants to be something that follows in that vein. Unfortunately, it is absolutely horrendous and does not come remotely close to making it there. If it had anywhere near the polish of Kabuki Quantum Fighter, it would have been one of the best games of the year, but it had absolutely zero polish. F tier, Windmill Slam. Let's move on to the next game, Dr. Slump. And this set of games was honestly a little bit of a slump. I really do appreciate the Toriyama mini event that happened, and I appreciate just trying to give that overall tribute to Toriyama. Dr. Slump was not one of the games I particularly enjoyed out of it. It felt very repetitive at times, and it was just a little just overly obsessed with its own humor. The art in the game was very cute, but I just don't think it quite got anywhere it was trying to go. It's solidly better than Excalibur, but I am going to have to put Dr. Slump in the D tier. We come to Dragon Quest I, a classic traditional RPG. Very fun game. I had no experience with Dragon Quest before it came up. I ended up really enjoying it. This, unlike Dr. Slump, was one of the highlights of the Toriyama event. He doesn't quite make it to A tier, but very solid B tier game. Really enjoyed it. I definitely want to come back and experience some more Dragon Quest after experiencing it this year for the first time. Then we come to Go-Go Ackman, which was this weird sort of shmup action adventure game on the SNES. I could see this going in a couple different places because it had its ups and downs. Did get a little repetitive at times, but on the whole, it never felt like completely unfair or anything like that. I'd put it on like the B to C borderline. I think it's closer to C than to B, but ultimately, this was a decent game. Like, it's definitely worth checking out. Now we come into the first of 2 consecutive Dragon Ball Z games, which is the GBA's Legacy of Goku. Uh, this was the weaker of the 2 Dragon Ball Z games, but it was still a pretty fun game overall. It comes in towards the tail end of the B tier, but it was solidly fun. I'm not the biggest Dragon Ball Z fan overall, but despite not knowing the actual series itself very well, it was quite an interesting game to play, along with its next one, the Attack of the Saiyans from DS, which I'm going to go ahead and put up here in the A tier. This was the better of the 2 Dragon Ball Z games. They aren't that far apart, but it was enough better that I think it deserves the bump into A tier. Moving on, we have NES's Chip and Dale. And this was a game that I knew relatively little about, except for the fact that there were some rumors that it might have been, classic NES hard, looks friendly and fun, but all of a sudden it's going to absolutely destroy you. It did not actually end up doing that nearly as much as some of the intimidation factor of looking at like classic NES hard might have suggested. I am going to go ahead and put this all the way into the S tier. I'm not ranking within the S tier yet. We'll figure out the ranking of the S tier when we get to our overall top 10 list at the end of this. Next, we have PC Engine CD's Loom. Loom was this sort of music-focused adventure story game. Honestly, quite a fun game overall. A little simplistic for what it was, but that was to be expected. It had some cool concepts actually, where you end up having to like play the songs that it teaches you backwards in order to reverse the effects of the magic. And I think it had enough cool touches that I'm willing to give it a B tier spot right in here. Dragon Quest Rocket Slime was also skipped. I forgot to include that in my skip list earlier. Moving on, we have SpongeBob Atlantis. SpongeBob Atlantis was an okay game. Ultimately, it was not one of the better games of the year. I think it gets a spot in the C tier just for not having enough going on in it. It wasn't particularly difficult, but it also wasn't particularly interesting. I think it can get its spot in the C tier. It wasn't actively bad at any point. Next, we come to a sort of puzzly, I guess I'd call it a puzzly action adventure in Frogger's Adventure 2. And again, this was an absolute gem. You've got interesting fight against a mage at the end of it, where you're having to run around to different tiles, flip them over. You've got all these interesting patterns of, okay, I just have these simple actions where these springs are going to jump me a couple steps forward. This is going to be one of our contenders for Achievement of the Year and Game of the Year. Moving on from Frogger Adventure, we have the SNES game Pretty Fighter. What if we had a fighting game and took everything interesting out of it and just tried to make all of the characters appealing in the most just basic ways that we can? That would give us something called Pretty Fighter, which was just a clear D tier. It was not particularly pretty or interesting. It was basically took all of the things that could have been interesting about a fighting game and ignored all of them. After this, we have an absolutely wild shmuppy sort of game. I don't know if shmup is technically the correct term for it. We had Bangai-O on the Dreamcast. This had some absolutely wild mechanics where you would just have this huge burst of bombs coming out. You needed to like wait for the boss to shoot off a gazillion missiles so you could counter bomb them back. It was actually a really cool experience. Not overall one of the styles of games that I thought was the most interesting this year, but it ended up being pretty exciting, and I am going to put it into the B tier, I think. Let's put it there. Now we come to our second Tony Hawk Game of the Year, Tony Hawk Underground 2 on the PS2. And I would say out of the Tony Hawk games that we had this year, this was definitely the better of the two. I think it asked less ridiculous things of you in terms of, like, it didn't have particularly infuriating, like, gap tricks and stuff like that. or sorry, manual gap manuals. It didn't have as infuriating like flip tricks off the edge. Um, it asked more reasonable things of you, and it asked more fun things of you. And because of that, I'm going to give this an A tier spot, which I never thought would happen for a skateboarding game, but here we are. Now we come to Kirby Superstar Ultra on the DS. And Kirby Superstar Ultra is one of the best Kirby games I've ever played. Probably the best Kirby game I've ever played. I am going to go ahead and move this all the way to our S tier Game of the Year candidates immediately, and we can have more of a discussion on it when we get to re-ranking our eventual top 10. Now we're going to come to Mario 64, The Purple Stars. This was our Mario 64 ROM hack of the year. It was not one of the worst ROM hacks I've ever played. At times it turned very repetitive, navigating around the stages, required a lot of like just very consistent double jumps. It was not the best ROM hack I've ever played, but it also wasn't the worst ROM hack I've ever played. It's a low B tier game, could probably even be high C tier, but I'm willing to put it towards the lower end of B tier here. Next, we're going to come up to the SNES game Equinox. And Equinox was the follow-up to Solstice, which was a game that appeared last year and ended up being just this very cool asymmetric action-adventure game. Very good game. Honestly, I am willing to put this... I don't think it makes it quite to S tier, but I'm willing to put this like right in contention for those top 10 slots of the year. Depending on how many other games end up taking up those slots, I could easily see this sneaking into the end of the top 10. After that, we come to Monster World 4. I don't quite think I liked this as much as I expected to. When I first looked at it, I thought this game was going to be pretty cool, but the exploration elements just didn't really quite work out as well as I thought they would. I'm going to go ahead and put this into C tier. This was one of the games I was more disappointed by. When I took a look at this game, when I saw it come up, I thought this had the potential to be like a solid B, maybe even A tier game, and I think it just didn't quite live up to the potential that it had. I still enjoyed it. Next up, we have Cotton 2, Magical Dreams on the Saturn. And this is another one of those games that had the potential to be interesting, but didn't quite live up to that potential. It was kind of disappointing. I think it's going to get itself a spot in the D tier. It wasn't abjectly horrible or anything, but it just didn't have as much going on as it looked like it had the promise to. And it was a little disappointing, while still not being absolutely horrible. It's certainly no Excalibur. From there, we come to Lilo and Stitch 2. Lilo and Stitch 2 was basically your classic like puzzle-solving platformer. It wasn't particularly original. It wasn't particularly bad either, though. A solid B-tier puzzle platformer. Can't ask for much more than what we got of it for what it's trying to be, but it wasn't a fantastic game either. I'll put it at the back end of the B tier. I don't think it really gets much higher than that. Going from there, we go to the absolutely janky PS1's Chicken Run, a stealth game in which you are playing as a claymated chicken. And it was about as good as that sentence describes, because I think that sentence might have been the most interesting thing about it, other than the abject terror of being caught by those stupid dogs yet again. As a result, this gets a spot in the D tier, and even towards the back end of the D tier verging on F tier. Next, we get to Shin Megami Tensei. Our second consecutive PS1 game, but this one fared a lot. Shin Megami Tensei was a very interesting, like, classic monster/demon capture RPG, and I think it absolutely lived up to its potential. So we're going to go ahead and move that up into our B tier, and I think I'm even willing to put it at the top of the B tier. It doesn't quite make the cut to A, I don't think, at least from what I've experienced of it so far. but it did what it was trying to do, and it did it very well. From Shin Megami Tensei, we're going to move on to the Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix game on the GameCube. Now, playing a dance game with a controller is already an interesting experience. And this was definitely a very like bizarre music drives the entire world story, masquerading as a dance game. Um, it earns some points for its quirkiness, but I don't think it makes it out of C tier. I think it has to stay in C tier. I don't think we can go much higher than that with this. Next, we have Drawn to Life, the game in which you draw all of the objects using the magic of a DS touchscreen. And all of those objects get incorporated into a very basic and ultimately not very interesting platformer. D tier. From there, we move to another one of our hacks this year, the Kirby Halloween Edition on the NES of Kirby's Adventure. And this was honestly one of the better games of the year. It absolutely deserves its spot further up the list. I'm not going to put it all the way in S tier, but this was a very fun Kirby hack. Superstar Ultra gets that S tier spot, but this one does not quite get the S tier spot. It gets an upper A tier spot. From there, we move to the GameCube Mickey's Magical Mirror. This was functionally a point-and-click adventure game, but one that did fairly well at being what it was, right? It's this point-and-click adventure with some mini games. However, some of the puzzles in it were extremely like obscure and obtuse. It basically ended up like, relying on guides way more than you would expect for a children's like point and click adventure game. I appreciate what went into it, but I don't think this can go any higher than D tier. Let's put it here. From here, we come to one of the most universally beloved games of the year, Donkey Kong 94, which was functionally the precursor to the Mario vs. DK series of games starting on the GBA. But this was basically a puzzle solving game involving Donkey Kong and objects. This is going to go all the way up to S tier immediately. From there, we get the story-based game Myst from the 3DO system you don't get to see very often. This was another adventure game with extremely obscure puzzles and flickering back and forth between a bunch of rooms. I'm sure in its day it was extremely innovative. Unfortunately, it has not really held up that well over time and came away kind of clunky. From there, we're going to go to Monkey Ball 2 on the GameCube. Monkey Ball 2 was one of the highlights of the year. A very fun tilting game where you just, spin the stage around, make the monkeys roll around, and try to get to the goal. A couple very frustrating stages, but overall, awesome game. A tier. From there, we move to Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast. This was actually the second 3D Sonic game that I played this year after Sonic Heroes on the GameCube. Both of these games had some interesting high-flying feel to them. I don't think this one was quite as solid as Sonic Heroes, but I still think this was a very good 3D Sonic game. I'm going to give it the A tier. Lots of fun stuff going on here in it. Next, we move to Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. Boom. Instant S tier. Fantastic game. Didn't have a ton of experience with the Castlevania series before, but as action RPGs go, this has everything you could want in an ARPG. Immediate S tier. Next, we have Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, which tries to take open world concept and apply it to a Kirby game. And I think it does a decent job of it, but it doesn't quite work as well because Kirby and open world games just aren't as good of a combination as the other Kirby games that we've seen. Um, right, moving from there, we have the Mario and Luigi Partners in Time. Now, I was a huge fan of Superstar Saga back in the day, and this is the sequel to that. And honestly, it lived up to it. It was not quite as strong as Superstar Saga, which would be a very high S tier game, but it still gets into the S tier. Even the slightly more awkward version of like the items, bros attacks, still gets it into the S tier. And from there, we move to Evolution, the World of Sacred Device, which is this week's game. And as much as I liked Torneco's Mystery Dungeon, I liked this one also. So it's also going to get a spot in the S tier. I think the Mystery Dungeon games we played this year, both of them, the Torneco and the Evolution, ended up being fantastic roguelike dungeon crawlers. Absolutely zero complaints there. From there, we go to Tomato Adventure. What was not to love about this game? It was quirky, it was wild. It captures a lot of the similar spirit to those Mario and Luigi games, Superstar Saga, Partners in Time, completely original franchise in a world full of absolute like vegetable craziness. Um, it is hard to really pick much fault with that, and Tomato Adventure gets an S tier spot. Next, we get Okami on the PS2. Okami was a very solid game. Very cool. You've got this whole paintbrush mechanic. You've got your spirit wolf. I think this was absolutely one of the coolest games to get to experience this year. It is going to get the top spot in the A tier with only a few games left to go. From there, we move to Legend of Mana on the PS1. And Legend of Mana on the PS1 is going to be one of our top games of the year. It is an S tier contender. Just so many branching paths, so many ways to influence the story, building placement, building order, gazillions of quests. It was such a cool exploration game in an ARPG. Absolutely gets one of those S tier spots. Next, we have Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, a classic tactics game on the GameCube. Very cool story elements going on, as well as just a very solid like tactical strategy RPG. This is going to get a high A tier spot. And finally, we have Mario Party 4. Now, I've always been a huge fan of the single player Mario Party experience, much more than your average player. And I am going to go ahead and put this into the A tier. As Mario Party games go, this was admittedly one of the weaker story writing Mario Party games, but you aren't really playing for the story. You're playing them for hijinks, wackiness, and playing through the story as a way to experience some of that hijinks and wackiness. It makes it into the A tier, but towards the lower end of the A tier, I would say. So from there, we're going to look at our overall top 10 games and count them down. And we have exactly 10 games in our S tier, if I'm counting correctly. So we're now going to try to figure out what order to rank those S tier games in. So out of these 10 S tier games, I think our number 10 is going to end up being Frogger's Adventure 2. As much as I did like it, I don't think it quite lives up to the others. Still, extremely solid game. Absolutely loved it. I think just some of those puzzle elements in it, those action elements, just having to figure out, okay, here's how I get from this section of the level to that section of the level. We need to jump here, get this hidden collectible. Very great game. Coming in number 9, we have Kirby's Superstar Ultra. Everything I said about earlier, just all of the different stories, the incredibly hard arena mode at the end. Absolutely loved it. That's going to get in here in our number 9 spot. Number 8, we're going to get Mario and Luigi Partners in Time. Superstar Saga would have been in contention for the overall number 1 spot. Partners in Time's a little further behind, in part because Bros items are not quite as satisfying as Bros attacks, but still, fantastic game. Absolutely loved it. And at number 7, we have one of our Roguelike Dungeon Crawlers Evolution, the most recent game, and I don't think this is just recency bias talking. It's a very fun game, especially with the sneaking around behind mechanics. Um, Trying to fight through floors of a dungeon, exploring it, and just trying to line up all of your magic abilities to make sure you're going to have enough of the mana equivalent in it, lining up the dungeon crawling, finding all the items, figuring out when you can spend those items. Fantastic game, very cool game. Really enjoyed it. Number 6, we're going to have our puzzle solving platformer, DK94. Uh, I expect to see this on a lot of people's top 10 lists for the year. I'm going to give it the number 6 spot. I think it shows a lot of the promise that the future Mario vs. DK entries will have. And I think just some of the various like item manipulation, key manipulation, enemy moving that was involved with it made it a really cool experience to play. Number 5, we get Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. Metroidvanias are a genre of game that, at least for me, was one of the highlights of the year between games like Super Metroid and this. I absolutely think Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow was a very cool experience to play, and I'm glad that this came up. Coming in number 4, we have Legend of Mana. Legend of Mana, as I said before, all of the fantastic branching paths of your story. You can complete any one of the 3 main paths. And you'll eventually get to the ending story. I think it had a lot of extremely cool things going on, and I'm really glad that we got to experience this game that I don't know that I would have otherwise even heard of or thought about. Coming in at number 3, we have the OG Mystery Dungeon, Torneko Mystery Dungeon. Everything that I said about it before, right? Trying to operate your little shop, trying to go around and explore this dungeon. And I believe the final dungeon is one of those classic 99 floor dungeons. So you have a lot of content to experience in this game. Absolutely live up to the hype. We're down to 2 now. We have Chip and Dale on the NES, Tomato Adventure on the GBA. Which one gets the number 1 spot? And it is going to be Tomato Adventure. That is my pick for Game of the Year here, Tomato Adventure. I think the quirky gadget system just left so many interesting mechanics that you had to manage. As much as I loved the amazingly smooth, cool platform experience of Chip and Dale, I have to give the number 1 spot to our quirky vegetable friends of Tomato Adventure. So with that, that has been our ranking of the games of Achievement of the Week and Month for 2024, all the way from Tomato Adventure at the top to Excalibur at the bottom. This has been the Elk Speaks, signing off. I hope to see you in more content. Thanks for joining us today.